The room was quiet, save for the rustling of a heavy velvet curtain that barely moved in the breeze outside Windsor Castle. A cup of tea sat untouched beside a woman whose legacy stretched over 7 decades. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, now scanned the empty hallway ahead, not with fear, but with an unmistakable weariness. Behind her, servants moved quietly, respectfully, as they always had. But one among them, Paul Wybrew, a footman whose loyalty to the crown had never wavered, noticed something different that day. The Queen had grown quieter, more withdrawn. Something had changed, and eventually, the truth would come out. It wasn't illness, not exactly. It wasn't simply age. It was something that had pierced deeper than even time could reach. Words. Harsh words from someone she had welcomed into the family, even against centuries of rigid royal instinct. And now, long after her passing, those words have resurfaced, brought into the daylight by the very man who stood beside her that day. He was a servant in title, but a witness in truth. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not a tabloid fantasy or a clickbait gossip fest. It's the unraveling of a haunting truth, one that has simmered in the dark corridors of the monarchy, hidden beneath layers of protocol, reputation, and silence. For the first time, a former royal footman is pulling back the veil to reveal what he heard, what he saw, and what he believes may have been the emotional blow that cracked the final wall holding Queen Elizabeth together. The name Meghan Markle needs no introduction. Once hailed as the breath of fresh air the monarchy desperately needed, she stormed into royal life with charisma, poise, and modern flair. The world watched with fascination as Prince Harry found his bride, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the royal family was undergoing a transformation. But behind the flashing cameras, the carefully curated public smiles, and the global headlines branding them as the new Fab Four, something was amiss. What if, behind the gilded gates of Buckingham and Windsor, a far different story was unfolding? What if those grand palaces held not just tradition and pageantry, but pain, deep, emotional pain? And what if the last reigning monarch in British history, Queen Elizabeth II, was not just dying from old age, but slowly unraveling from a heartbreak no one dared speak about until now? Paul Wybrew had always considered discretion to be his greatest tool. Years of loyal service had taught him to watch everything and say nothing. He'd witnessed state dinners, royal disputes, and even a few near explosions of emotion that never made it to the public. But nothing quite prepared him for what he overheard in a corridor not far from the Queen's personal sitting room, a moment he describes not as a confrontation, but a verbal ambush cloaked in cold civility. She said to Her Majesty, quite plainly, Wybrew later recalled in a confidential testimony, "You're just a stubborn old woman clinging to power." There was a pause, he says, and then another blow. "You're irrelevant and outdated. You're holding back the image we're trying to build." No one dared speak in that moment. Not the Queen, not the staff in earshot, and certainly not Prince Harry, who was said to be nearby but never intervened. What does it take to emotionally wound a woman who lived through wars, scandals, and the very invention of celebrity culture? Could a few cruel words really unravel someone of such magnitude? Or was it the context that made them lethal? The betrayal from within the family she fought so hard to protect, the biting judgment from someone she had shown nothing but grace? This story isn't just about Meghan Markle. It's not even just about the Queen. It's about how words, especially the wrong words spoken at the most vulnerable moment, can outlive even the most powerful people. How a woman like Queen Elizabeth, who ruled a nation and represented billions, could be hurt not by a foreign enemy, not by a rebellious parliament, but by someone she once called family. You may wonder why this story is coming out now. Why Wybrew, a man who kept palace secrets buried for decades, has decided to speak. The answer is heartbreakingly simple: guilt. In the months following the Queen's death, as tributes poured in and the world stood still to mourn a life of service, one man carried something heavier than grief. He carried the weight of witnessing something he could no longer suppress. "I should have said something sooner," Wybrew admitted in private. But the Queen wouldn't have wanted a scene. That was never her way. Indeed, Queen Elizabeth was known for her restraint, her stoicism, her ability to absorb personal affronts without blinking. But even monarchs have limits. And when those limits are pushed by someone inside the royal circle, it leaves more than a bruise. It leaves a scar. The scandalous quote is now making its way through media circles, with sources scrambling to verify its authenticity. But this exposé isn't built on whispers. It's built on first-hand testimony from a man who stood close enough to feel the tension rise in the air. A man who watched the Queen's hands tremble slightly as she returned to her seat. A man who saw the breath leave her lungs in a long, silent sigh, as if part of her had been chipped away by something she could never quite speak about. The timing couldn't be more haunting. The confrontation reportedly occurred not long before Queen Elizabeth's final public appearances, during a time when many close to her say she looked tired, emotionally distant, and uncharacteristically subdued. Her famous twinkle, gone. Her sharp wit, dulled. And her once unshakable poise, fractured, just enough to be noticed by those who truly knew her. And yet, none of this made it into the news. Why? Because the royal family is nothing if not a fortress of controlled narratives. For generations, the motto has been, never complain, never explain. But this time, perhaps the silence did more damage than good. Because now the question hangs in the air like smoke. Was this confrontation a final emotional blow for the Queen? And if so, how should history remember it? The video you're watching will take you behind the scenes, into the closed-door moments you never saw. It will unpack the psychological tension, the betrayal, and the personal pain hidden behind royal smiles and ceremonial perfection. You'll hear testimony not just from Paul Wybrew, but also context from other staff, former journalists, and even members of the public who began to see changes in the Queen long before her health officially declined. This is not just a story, it's a reckoning. A reckoning with the idea that no one, not even the longest reigning monarch in British history, is immune from cruelty. As we dig deeper into the events leading to Queen Elizabeth's final days, we'll revisit key moments, from Meghan's entrance into the royal world, to the rising tensions behind palace walls, to the silence that fell after the confrontation, and what it may have cost the crown. Because sometimes, the true weight of a monarchy isn't found in gold or ceremony. It's in the broken heart of the woman who bore it all. With grace, and, perhaps in the end, with one final wound she never spoke about again. This is the untold story of a sentence that may have shattered a sovereign. This is the revelation no one was ready to hear. This is where the truth begins. He was never the kind of man you'd notice in a room full of royals. He moved with practiced silence, hands always folded respectfully in front of him, eyes trained just slightly downward, but never disengaged. His role was simple on paper, yet infinitely complex in practice. He was a royal footman, a silent guardian of tradition, a background presence in moments that would define British history. His name? Paul Wybrew. For more than 3 decades, Paul served under Queen Elizabeth II, first as a young attendant stationed at Buckingham Palace, later as a trusted senior footman across Windsor, Sandringham, and Balmoral. His career spanned multiple generations of the royal family. He saw Charles marry Diana, witnessed William and Harry grow up in the aftermath of their mother's death, and watched Queen Elizabeth weather storms both political and personal. Through it all, Paul remained precisely what the palace expected of him: discreet, loyal, and invisible. But time has a way of bending even the most rigid codes of silence. And now, years after stepping away from royal service, Paul Wybrew has found his voice. And that voice carries the weight of a secret he never intended to share. A moment between Meghan Markle and Queen Elizabeth that, he believes, carried enough emotional force to alter the Queen's final year forever. To understand the power of Paul's testimony, one must first understand Paul himself. He grew up not far from Windsor, the son of a military man and a church organist. From a young age, Paul was fascinated by structure, by the way tradition shaped lives. He found early discipline in boarding school, then a sense of purpose during his short stint with the British Army. But it was his first visit to Buckingham Palace, during a school holiday tour, that set his path in motion. The gilded halls, the rhythmic steps of guards, the air of dignity and duty, it gripped him like a religion. By his 21st birthday, Paul was wearing the royal livery and taking instructions from senior household members with the kind of fervor most reserved for generals or priests. He worked long hours, woke before dawn, and learned the nuances of service that only a palace life could teach. How to fold a napkin for a foreign dignitary. How to enter a room so your footsteps made no sound. How to speak with clarity, yet never overstep. He took immense pride in knowing when to be present and when to disappear. That duality made him a favorite among the Queen's closest aides, and over time, he became one of the few footmen permitted to serve the Queen directly in her private quarters. This wasn't a matter of title or seniority, it was trust. A trust built over years of quiet observance and unwavering dedication. Yet Paul wasn't naive. He saw what others didn't, or wouldn't admit. He saw the cracks in the royal family's facade long before the press did. He saw the tension between Charles and Diana before the world heard whispers of infidelity. He saw Prince Harry's restless spirit as he grew older, his discomfort with formality, his growing distance from royal life. And yes, he saw the pain in the Queen's eyes, on the days when the weight of the crown seemed less ceremonial and more personal. Still, Paul never said a word. He kept journals, but never published. He was offered book deals, he declined. His silence was his loyalty, and his loyalty was his currency. So why now? Why, after all these years of keeping palace secrets under lock and key, did Paul Wybrew decide to speak about Meghan Markle's alleged outburst against Queen Elizabeth? The answer, he says, came during the Queen's funeral procession. He had retired by then, no longer wearing the red and gold livery, no longer walking the halls he once polished by hand. But he watched the televised funeral like the rest of the world, glued to the screen, his eyes searching the procession not for the grand, but for the human. And what he saw disturbed him. He saw Meghan Markle, dressed in black, walking in solemn silence just behind the Queen's coffin. She kept her gaze low, face composed, movements calculated. To the public, it was a picture of dignity and mourning. But to Paul, it was something else. He couldn't shake the memory of that day, months earlier, when he stood a few paces from the Queen's drawing room and heard Meghan's voice slice through the silence like a blade. She didn't yell. That would have been too obvious. She didn't scream. That would have drawn too much attention. But the words were there, sharp, biting, deliberate. You're just a stubborn old woman clinging to power. And worse, you're irrelevant and outdated. Paul remembers the Queen's posture changing ever so slightly. Her shoulders, once held upright even in exhaustion, seemed to cave in, just a little. Enough for Paul to notice. Enough for him to realize that something irreversible had happened. He didn't know what to do at the time. There was no protocol for such a moment. You don't correct a royal. You certainly don't involve yourself in family disputes. And so, as always, he stayed quiet. He resumed his duties. He polished silver. He delivered tea. But the words echoed. They haunted him. And when he saw Meghan at the funeral, publicly mourning the very woman she had, he believed, wounded in private, something inside Paul broke. The Queen deserved better. She deserved truth. He didn't go to the press immediately. He spoke to close friends, former colleagues. Eventually, he agreed to a private, recorded interview, never intending for it to be released. But the audio was leaked. A few journalists caught wind, and the dominoes began to fall. What followed was not fanfare or publicity. Paul never sought the spotlight. In fact, he's turned down every offer for live interviews. But he did agree to one thing, a full account, not just of what was said, but of who the Queen was, and how moments like that don't just come and go. They live inside a person. They change them. To this day, Paul remains careful with his words. He never calls Meghan a villain. He doesn't speculate on her motives. He doesn't accuse her of malice. What he does say is simple, but profound. Those words hurt her. I saw it. And that's what makes this exposé so different from the countless others. This isn't about drama. This isn't about gossip. It's about a man who spent his life in the shadows of royalty, who watched a queen suffer in silence, and who, for the first time in his life, felt it was more honorable to speak than to stay quiet. This chapter in royal history was almost lost, buried beneath state ceremonies, tabloid headlines, and public decorum. But now, through the voice of someone who truly lived within the monarchy's walls, we're beginning to understand the toll those walls can take on those who live inside them and those who serve them. In the beginning, there was hope, not cautious optimism or reserved approval, but true, effervescent hope, the kind the monarchy hadn't felt in years. For once, the headlines about the royal family weren't scandal or stagnation. they were about renewal. The engagement of Prince Harry to Meghan Markle had the world buzzing with excitement. She wasn't just a commoner. She was American, biracial, divorced, and fiercely independent. To many, Meghan represented the monarchy's first real opportunity to evolve, to break with centuries of convention and finally embrace the modern age. And for a moment, it looked like that hope might hold. Within the palace, Meghan's arrival sparked genuine curiosity. Staff who had grown accustomed to the formality of royal life were suddenly interacting with someone who wasn't raised within the walls of tradition. Meghan asked questions, challenged assumptions, and reportedly referred to some palace protocols as outdated. She smiled easily, hugged people she met, breaking centuries of physical distance that had been taught to every royal spouse before her. It was unusual, yes, but not unwelcome. At first, behind closed doors, there was a mix of admiration and concern. Meghan had undeniable charisma. She carried herself with the poise of someone used to cameras, and her interviews were polished, passionate, and politically aware. She seemed ready to take on a role that had crushed others before her. But there was something else beneath the surface, an urgency, a quiet impatience that simmered beneath the courtesies and camera-ready smiles. Meghan was ready to change the monarchy, but it wasn't clear if the monarchy was ready to change for her. Those who worked within the palace began to notice small things. Meghan would arrive early to meetings, expecting fast-paced results and firm deadlines. But royal institutions don't operate like television studios or Hollywood agencies. They move at the speed of diplomacy, slow, deliberate, and often agonizingly procedural. She was frequently frustrated by how long it took to approve speeches, edit press releases, or confirm public appearances. One aide remarked privately, she was expecting a boardroom, and she walked into a museum. Still, no one could deny her effect on Prince Harry. He looked different, lighter, more animated, more sure of himself. Meghan had given him something he'd long been missing, a sense of agency, a chance to forge his own path. And for a time, the Queen supported this. She had seen enough history to understand that the crown must adapt or risk decay. Meghan was invited to Christmas at Sandringham before the wedding, a rare gesture of inclusion. The Queen even allowed Meghan to ride in the same car as her to a royal event. To insiders, these were more than gestures, they were endorsements. But goodwill, in the palace, has an expiration date. It doesn't end with a crash, but with a drift, a slow, subtle shift from excitement to unease. Palace staff began whispering about what they called Meghan's California style. Her habit of emailing aides at 5 a.m., expecting replies. Her preference for informal greetings. Her questioning of wardrobe expectations. Some saw these as signs of an outsider trying to modernize an archaic system. Others saw them as red flags, a lack of respect for the institution. There were other incidents, too. The infamous argument over the bridesmaids' dresses, reportedly involving Princess Charlotte, left a sour taste in the mouths of several royal aides. Meghan's side insisted it was a minor disagreement. Others claimed the Queen had to intervene personally to smooth things over. Then came the claims that Meghan had made Kate Middleton cry, or was it the other way around? The press went in circles, but inside the palace, tensions were mounting. One senior aide, speaking years later on condition of anonymity, described it as a clash of expectations and reality. Meghan, she said, arrived thinking she could bring about sweeping change. The palace, meanwhile, expected her to integrate seamlessly into a system designed not for innovation, but for preservation. She wanted transformation. We wanted stability. That's where the storm began. But it wasn't just the staff who noticed. The Queen herself, ever watchful, reportedly observed Meghan's early palace days with interest. She saw the charm, the ambition, and the growing gap between Meghan and the rest of the royal family. While she appreciated Meghan's desire to contribute meaningfully, she also valued discretion, patience, and duty above all else. In Meghan, she saw a spark, bright, beautiful, and possibly uncontrollable. There's a story, never confirmed, but widely discussed, about a private meeting between the Queen and Meghan early in the Duchess's royal journey. It was said to be cordial but pointed. The Queen, according to a former advisor, reminded Meghan of the importance of the crown's legacy, that her role wasn't just about personal impact, it was about collective duty. Meghan reportedly nodded, smiled, thanked Her Majesty, and left the room. But some say her expression afterward told a different story. She wanted to lead the parade, one insider said. But the monarchy doesn't do parades for individuals. Then came the public tours: Australia, New Zealand, Tonga, and Fiji. It was the Sussexes' first major overseas engagement, and by all public accounts, a success. Crowds adored them. Meghan was radiant. Harry was confident. But behind the scenes, reports of tension resurfaced. Meghan reportedly clashed with staff about scheduling, attire, and protocol. In one instance, aides claimed she refused to attend a planned engagement over security concerns that had already been cleared. The tour was glamorous, yes, but it strained the already fraying threads between Meghan and the palace machinery. It was around this time that Meghan began to feel isolated. In later interviews, she would describe feeling unsupported, unheard, even targeted. Her American background, her race, her outspokenness, all became fuel for media scrutiny. But inside the palace, there was little done to shield her. Some staff say they weren't sure how. Others say they didn't think it was their place. And some, Paul Wybrew among them, believed a silent wall had already formed between Meghan and the heart of the royal household. Wybrew wasn't in the room for every conversation, but he was close enough to feel the shift. He described Meghan's presence as magnetic but restless. She smiled politely, but there was always a question in her eyes, as if she were silently measuring every tradition, every rule, every person around her. She was trying to find her place, he said, but she didn't want to fit into the system. She wanted the system to fit her. This chapter of Meghan's royal life is perhaps the most complicated. It defies simple narratives. She was neither entirely welcomed nor completely rejected. She was adored by the public, but questioned by the institution. And while her intentions may have been rooted in progress, they often clashed with a structure built to resist rapid change. As months went on, the optimism that once surrounded her began to fade. Not because she had failed, but because the palace had no framework for someone like her. It was as if she had stepped onto a moving train, but insisted on steering it from the rear carriage. She brought ideas, charity initiatives, new communication strategies, calls for mental health support, but each one had to navigate layers of approval, etiquette, and caution. The process wore her down, and she wasn't shy about expressing her frustration. At first, staff brushed off the tension. She'll adapt, they said. It's just growing pains. But with each passing month, the murmurs grew louder. And then came the moment that would shatter the illusion of unity. A private exchange, not long after a senior family meeting, where Meghan allegedly confronted Queen Elizabeth with the now infamous words, "You're just a stubborn old woman clinging to power." But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the climax of a slow, painful build-up, a chasm that had been growing since Meghan's first palace days. A conflict not of good versus evil, but of change versus tradition, independence versus duty, identity versus legacy. The Meghan Markle who arrived at the palace was full of energy, vision, and hope. But she had walked into a centuries-old machine that did not yield to individual ambition, not even for a duchess. And in her early days, what began as promise quietly unraveled into mistrust. Meghan's intentions were likely genuine. She wanted to make a difference. She wanted to feel heard. But in the House of Windsor, being heard is a privilege that comes only after years of silence. It's earned, never given. And for Meghan, that trade-off was too steep. For most of her life, Queen Elizabeth II had been seen as the unshakable pillar of the United Kingdom. Her image was carved in coins. Her portrait hung in courts and parliaments. Her voice had calmed a nation during war, death, and disaster. In the eyes of millions, she was immortal, not literally, but symbolically. There was a belief, unspoken but deeply felt, that no matter what happened in the world, the Queen would always be there. Stoic, composed, watching, guiding, enduring. But in the twilight of her reign, that image began to crack. Not in grand gestures or televised meltdowns, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Her gait slowed. Her smile lingered too long to mask fatigue. Her eyes, once glinting with steely confidence, began to soften into something far more human, something closer to sadness. By the time Meghan Markle entered the royal fold, Queen Elizabeth had already endured more than most mortals do in a lifetime. She had seen the death of her father at a young age, the abdication scandal that shook the monarchy, the assassination of Lord Mountbatten, multiple wars, economic collapses, the rise and fall of prime ministers, and of course, the unraveling of her own children's marriages. But in her later years, the nature of the turmoil changed. It became more personal, less ceremonial. It didn't come from political upheaval or constitutional crisis. It came from within her own family. And that was the one battlefield the Queen never truly prepared for. It began with the slow decline of her husband, Prince Philip. The Duke of Edinburgh had been her anchor, her confidant, her bluntest advisor. Though often portrayed as gruff and rigid, he was also the only man who could look her in the eye and tell her the brutal truth. He was a man who, while marching 2 steps behind her in public, walked exactly beside her in private. His failing health in the final years of his life weighed heavily on her. She canceled appearances, shortened travel engagements, and began spending more time at Windsor than Buckingham, a shift in routine that signaled a change not just in preference, but in state of mind. Those who worked closely with her during this time described a woman who remained committed, but increasingly tired. There was no loss in her mental sharpness. She still read briefings daily, still reviewed government dispatches, still met with her prime ministers. But there was a visible erosion of joy. The radiance that once lit her expressions began to dim. Not entirely, but enough to be noticed by those who had served her longest. It was into this quiet, emotionally fragile environment that Meghan Markle walked, full of charisma, ambition, and the unrelenting attention of the world. The Queen, by all accounts, was receptive. She understood the excitement. She knew what it meant to bring a biracial American actress into the royal fold. She also knew the pressures such a role would carry. And so, in those early days, she extended gestures of unusual warmth, private meetings, personal car rides, even invitations to her own apartments, luxuries few outside the core family were ever granted. But beneath the grace, Queen Elizabeth had reservations. Not about Meghan's character, necessarily, but about the speed at which the institution was expected to change. She had spent a lifetime guarding the values of continuity, stability, and tradition. Sudden change, no matter how well-meaning, posed a threat to those ideals. It's not that she was against progress. She had, after all, evolved the monarchy through decades of shifting cultural landscapes. But change, to her, had to be slow, strategic, and earned, not demanded. That was where the first emotional fissures began to form. At private family gatherings, Meghan's directness was occasionally jarring. Her questions, innocent to most, were seen by some royals as challenges to authority. And while the Queen never scolded her publicly, insiders say she was visibly uncomfortable when long-standing traditions were questioned without context. There were moments, quiet ones, where the Queen would retreat to her private chambers with her ladies-in-waiting and say little for the rest of the evening. Moments when even her most trusted staff could sense her internal conflict. But perhaps the most vulnerable aspect of Queen Elizabeth's final years was not the behavior of Meghan, nor even the public controversies. They were merely the surface ripples of something deeper. Her true pain stemmed from watching the family she had built and held together for decades fracture in front of her. She had lived through Diana. She had endured the public scorn when the royal family was perceived as cold. She had weathered Andrew's disgrace, Charles's scandals, and the quiet discontent that simmered in her grandsons. But the rift between William and Harry struck a different chord. It wasn't a political failure. It was maternal. It was intimate. It hurt in ways royal protocol could never address. She had seen William grow into the future king, disciplined and dutiful. She had seen Harry grow into the spirited spare, emotional and impulsive. She had hoped they would balance each other. She had hoped Diana's boys would bring the monarchy into a gentler age. But instead, she watched them drift apart, pulled by different values, different expectations, and perhaps different women. When Meghan and Harry began their complaints, first behind palace walls, then in public interviews, the Queen's discomfort was more than political. It was personal. The Oprah interview, though watched by millions, was watched by the Queen in private. One can only imagine what went through her mind as she heard her grandson speak of feeling trapped and his wife speak of contemplating suicide. Reports suggest the Queen was saddened by the accusations, but those who knew her better knew what that word really meant. She felt betrayed, not because of the departure itself, not even because of the criticism, but because they had aired it all in public without ever having looked her in the eye and said the words to her directly. For a woman who valued face-to-face confrontation as the foundation of duty, this was the deepest cut of all. Then came the final blow. The words Meghan allegedly said to her in private, words that would later be brought to light by Paul Wybrew. That day, when Meghan reportedly told her, "You're just a stubborn old woman clinging to power," something shifted in the Queen. She didn't lash out. She didn't cry. She didn't storm off or demand an apology. Instead, she sat in silence. According to Wybrew, she simply looked out the window, hands clasped in her lap, and said nothing. But the silence was deafening. It wasn't just about the insult. It was about what it represented, a final breach of respect, a breakdown of the very values she had spent her life defending. Meghan's words weren't just rude. They were, to the Queen, symbolic of a new generation's failure to understand what the crown stood for. And coming from someone she had tried to embrace, it was devastating. After that, those around her noticed a shift. Her schedule became lighter. Her public appearances rarer. Her handwritten notes to staff, once frequent and thoughtful, slowed. She began spending more time alone or in the quiet company of her dogs and longtime aides. To outsiders, it was simply old age. But to insiders, it was emotional retreat. One courtier described her in those days as a candle that still burned. But the flame was flickering. She continued her duties, of course. She always would. She signed bills, greeted ambassadors, and kept up with state matters. But her warmth had dimmed. The sparkle in her eye that used to flash at corgis, grandchildren, and Christmas crackers was harder to find. When Prince Philip passed, it became clear to all that the Queen was walking through her final chapter. She stood alone at his funeral, a striking image that traveled the globe. But those who knew her say she had already begun grieving much earlier, not just for her husband, but for the monarchy itself, for the unity that once defined her family, for the respect that had begun to fade. And in that stillness, in the soft light of Windsor Castle's aging corridors, Queen Elizabeth felt something she rarely showed the world: fragility. She wasn't just a sovereign anymore. She was a widow, a grandmother, a matriarch watching her dynasty bend under the pressure of modernity. She no longer had the strength to fight every battle. And in the wake of Meghan's confrontation, she chose not to fight at all. She withdrew, not in bitterness, not in anger, but in heartbreak. She had ruled with patience, grace, and fortitude. She had weathered nearly every imaginable storm. But in the end, it wasn't the weight of the crown that broke her spirit. It was a whisper, a sentence spoken in haste, from someone she had tried to understand but never truly could. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The skies above Windsor were dull and overcast, casting a gray light over the ancient stonework of the castle. Inside, the rhythm of royal life carried on as it always had. Footmen walked the halls and practiced silence. Silver tea trays were polished and prepared. A meeting had been scheduled between Queen Elizabeth II and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. On paper, it was nothing out of the ordinary. A brief conversation, a check-in, a chat between sovereign and family. But what occurred within those walls that day would become the single most whispered-about moment in the final year of the Queen's life. An encounter so emotionally charged, so personally wounding, that it left a ripple through the fabric of the royal family. Paul Wybrew remembers every detail. He was standing just outside the Queen's private drawing room. At the time, he was preparing for what he believed would be a routine tea service. The Queen had requested her usual blend, Darjeeling, lightly steeped, no sugar, with a slice of lemon. Meghan had not specified any preference. Paul thought little of it. He had served tea 1,000 times before. But when Meghan arrived, something in her posture, in her face, struck him. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't deferential. She was direct, sharp-eyed, shoulders squared. Not angry, exactly, but focused. Paul noted it. It wasn't a crime to walk into a meeting with confidence, but it was unusual in the presence of the Queen. The door closed behind her. Paul stepped aside. What followed, he would later say, was one of the most chilling conversations he had ever overheard in all his years of service. Inside the drawing room, Queen Elizabeth sat in her favorite armchair, a lace cloth draped over one armrest. The corgis rested near the fireplace, barely raising their heads as Meghan took her seat across from the monarch. There was no grand entourage, no aides with notepads, no press. It was private, personal. It began civilly. The Queen reportedly greeted Meghan with warmth, commenting politely on her recent engagements. Meghan responded with equal civility, thanking the Queen for her time and hospitality. But quickly, the tone shifted. Meghan began speaking about image, about perception, about how the monarchy needed to modernize its public face, that younger generations didn't relate to cold tradition, that ceremonial stiffness was alienating people around the world. The Queen listened quietly, as she always did. She did not interrupt. Meghan, encouraged by the lack of resistance, continued. She referenced brand management, global platforms, and audience engagement. She expressed concern that the palace's slow-moving decisions were limiting her and Harry's impact. She made it clear that she wanted to build something new. According to Wybrew, this was the point where the Queen raised her hand, politely, gently, and said something along the lines of, "Dear, there are reasons why things move slowly here. The crown is not a brand. It is an institution." That response, intended as a gentle reminder of monarchy's essence, was met with what would later be described as an astonishing reply. "You're just a stubborn old woman clinging to power." The words landed like a brick against glass. No anger, no shouting, just precision. Cold, clinical, and then the second strike. "You're irrelevant and outdated. You're holding back the image we're trying to build." Inside the room, silence fell. Even the corgis, as Wybrew later recalled, seemed to still. He couldn't see the Queen's face, but he could hear her breathing. Slow, heavy. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't gasp or protest. Instead, she reportedly turned her gaze out the window, as if trying to process whether she had truly heard what she thought she had. Then, in an even voice, almost too quiet to hear, the Queen said something that Paul would remember forever. "You may see me as irrelevant, but I've carried this weight longer than you've been alive." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was a statement of fact, a reminder not of authority, but of legacy. Meghan didn't respond. Not right away. According to what Paul could hear, she shifted in her chair. There was a pause, and then, without further discussion, she stood, thanked the Queen for her time, and left. The meeting was over. Paul didn't make eye contact with Meghan as she exited. She nodded briefly in acknowledgement, her face unreadable. He entered the room moments later, as was protocol. The Queen was still seated. The tea was untouched. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes distant. She didn't speak. He asked softly, "Shall I bring in your next appointment, ma'am?" She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "That'll be all for today." She remained there for almost an hour. Alone. No phone calls. No visitors. Just silence. In the days that followed, there was no mention of the confrontation. No notes, no memos, no fallout. On the outside, palace life carried on. The Queen resumed her engagements. Meghan returned to Frogmore. But the atmosphere within Windsor had changed. Staff began whispering. People who were never supposed to know somehow learned pieces of the story. Rumors moved like wind through stone walls. The Queen's mood had altered. She became more quiet, less responsive in casual conversation. Her smiles were thinner. She began spending more time in private, sometimes sitting for hours in her personal library, paging through old photographs of her family, photos of her with Charles as a boy, with and Andrew, and of course, William and Harry. It was clear to those closest to her that something had been lost that day in the drawing room. Not just respect, but hope. Hope that the next generation would inherit not just the crown, but the character to carry it. What makes this moment so devastating isn't the sheer rudeness of Meghan's words, but what they revealed, an utter lack of regard for the woman who had opened the gates of the monarchy to her. Whether Meghan realized it or not, her words weren't just about tradition, they were about the person. They cut past protocol and struck something far more sacred. A monarch can weather insults to the institution, but insults to the soul, those leave a deeper wound. Paul Wybrew would later reflect on that moment with a heavy heart. "I don't think she expected it," he said. "Not from her. Not in that room." The confrontation marked a turning point. From that moment on, the Queen was different. She continued to perform her duties, but those closest to her said she aged more in the months that followed than she had in years. It was as if something had been taken from her, a quiet dignity bruised beyond repair. And perhaps that's why the story remained hidden for so long. The Queen never told anyone about it publicly. She never filed a complaint, never mentioned it again. But for those who watched her from the shadows, it was impossible to unsee the shift. She had been many things in her life: ruler, mother, wife, symbol. But above all, she had been a woman of grace. And that grace, in the face of such cruelty, did not shatter. But it did dim. In the weeks following the incident, she met with Charles, attended engagements, even spoke warmly in Christmas addresses. But her inner circle, including her physicians and private secretaries, noted a quiet withdrawal, a sense of mourning, not just for her husband, not just for time lost, but for the integrity of the institution she had spent her entire life defending. One close advisor said it best: she wasn't just disappointed in Meghan. She was disappointed in herself for believing it could have been different. That one conversation, 15 minutes behind a closed door, became, in hindsight, a defining emotional fracture in the Queen's final chapter. It didn't make headlines. It wasn't caught on camera, but it reverberated through the palace like thunder in a vault. Words are just air, people say, but when spoken in certain rooms, by certain mouths, they become blades. In the royal drama that unfolded behind palace walls, few figures carried the weight of inner conflict as heavily as Prince Harry. He was the grandson of Queen Elizabeth II, the monarch he adored, admired, and whose approval he had quietly sought his entire life. But he was also the husband of Meghan Markle, the woman he had vowed to protect, love, and stand beside no matter what. Between those two identities, a storm raged. And when that storm came crashing into the drawing room of Windsor Castle in the form of a confrontation between Meghan and the Queen, Harry found himself trapped in the center of a tragedy that may have forever altered the course of royal history. The question everyone would later ask, but no one dared to say aloud in the moment, was simple: where was Harry? Sources close to the palace confirmed that Harry was on the premises the day Meghan reportedly told the Queen she was a stubborn old woman clinging to power and irrelevant and outdated. He had arrived separately from Meghan that day, likely for meetings of his own. Some say he was in a nearby wing of the castle. Others believe he may have been in the courtyard or within earshot. Paul Wybrew, who was present in the hallway outside the Queen's drawing room, couldn't confirm Harry's exact location, but he did say he expected to see Harry with Meghan. When only one walked into the room, it struck him as odd. And yet, Harry did nothing to intervene. He didn't join the conversation. He didn't enter the room midway. He didn't console the Queen afterward. If he had been told what had happened, there was no indication he tried to mend it. This silence would later become its own wound. To understand why Harry may have stood by, or why he may have chosen not to react at all, requires looking far beyond that single afternoon. It requires understanding the years of slow-burning tension between Harry and the institution that raised him. Tension that began not with Meghan, but with the weight of the role he was never meant to have. Harry was the spare, the second son, the shadow to William's spotlight. For most of his life, he fulfilled that role with a mixture of mischief and charm. He partied, made headlines, went to war, and eventually carved out his own lane with causes close to his heart: wounded veterans, mental health awareness, and conservation. But even as he made a name for himself outside of palace protocols, he always remained a royal. And in that title lived both privilege and suffocation. His relationship with Queen Elizabeth had always been warm. She was his grandmother, yes, but also his monarch, his mentor, the only woman who had remained a steady constant in the aftermath of his mother's death. She provided structure when his world felt like chaos. She gave him space when he needed to rebel. And most importantly, she never judged him, at least not publicly. So when Meghan came into his life and began to question everything the monarchy stood for, Harry was caught between gratitude for the woman who had protected him and loyalty to the woman who had chosen him. He couldn't erase either bond, but he couldn't reconcile them either. In the early days of his relationship with Meghan, he reportedly confided in close friends that she was the one who finally sees me. For a man long defined by titles he never chose, prince, spare, misfit, soldier, Meghan's validation felt like oxygen. She understood the media's brutality. She had endured rejection, racism, and career uncertainty. She encouraged Harry to speak out, to defend her. to question the rules he had grown up with but never understood. And he listened. When the press turned on Meghan, Harry turned on the press. When the palace failed to defend her, he distanced himself from the palace. And when Meghan began to feel isolated within the royal family, Harry took it upon himself to fix what centuries of history had built. It was noble in intention, but devastating in execution. By the time the confrontation with the Queen took place, Harry had already begun retreating from royal life, emotionally, if not yet physically. He had reduced his public appearances. He had pulled away from his brother. And according to palace insiders, he had become increasingly cold towards staff, many of whom had served his grandmother for decades. There's an eerie detail that surfaced in the weeks following the alleged confrontation. A senior aide recalled seeing Harry walking alone along the gravel paths of the private gardens at Windsor later that same day. His head was down, hands in his coat pockets. He wasn't on a call. He wasn't speaking to anyone, just walking, as if something had happened, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. Did he know what Meghan had said? Did she tell him? Did he hear it himself from behind a door? Or did the Queen mention it? Briefly, quietly, in her usual restrained tone? We may never know. But what we do know is that Harry made no effort to address it publicly or privately. He didn't apologize. He didn't clarify. He didn't reach out. And to those inside the royal household, that silence spoke louder than any speech. One senior courtier described the mood inside Windsor Castle in the weeks that followed. It was like everyone was waiting for Harry to show up with a letter, a phone call, a word of regret, something. But it never came. Even among his cousins, Eugenie, Beatrice, Zara, there was unease. Some reportedly tried to speak with him, to convince him to ease the growing rift between Meghan and the Queen. But Harry, they said, was impenetrable, guarded, defensive. He believed they were siding with the institution. And in his mind, the institution had failed him and the woman he loved. Still, the pain he inflicted, intentionally or not, was real. The Queen, who had once been his anchor, now found herself alienated from the very grandson she had once seen as her most spirited hope. Perhaps the most tragic element in all of this is that Harry may have believed he was doing the right thing. He believed he was protecting his wife, standing up for his family, breaking generational cycles. But in trying to shield one person, he ended up wounding another, one who had shielded him when he was a child surrounded by flashbulbs and funerals. A former palace chaplain, who had observed the family for years, reflected on the dynamic. Harry's loyalty is his greatest strength, but sometimes it turns into a blindfold. He thought he was choosing love, but he didn't see who he was leaving behind. The press, of course, spun endless narratives. Some painted Harry as a hero breaking free from a cold system. Others called him a traitor. But neither headline captured the true heartbreak behind the scenes. A grandson who could not find a way to stand between two women he loved. One who gave him life, and one who gave him a new beginning. And so, in the end, he chose silence. Not because he didn't care, but perhaps because he cared too much and had no idea what to say. The confrontation between Meghan and Queen Elizabeth will be remembered for the words that were spoken. But the silence that followed, Harry's silence, may be the most painful echo of all. In the hours that followed the alleged confrontation between Meghan Markle and Queen Elizabeth II, Windsor Castle's outer facade remained calm and dignified, as it always did. The ceremonial guards stood still. The staff continued their tasks. Tourists, unaware of the emotional tempest that had just taken place within the Queen's private chambers, milled about the outskirts of the estate with cameras in hand, smiling at what they believed was history frozen in gold. But inside the palace, history was not frozen. It was moving, fast and dangerously uncontained. When Meghan walked out of the Queen's drawing room that day, not a single aide was aware of the exact words that had been exchanged. But the energy shifted instantly. Queen Elizabeth canceled the rest of her appointments. A second pot of tea, untouched. Scheduled calls were deferred. One of her senior private secretaries whispered to a lady-in-waiting, "She's not herself." The palace has weathered storms before, affairs, divorces, death. But this was different. It wasn't scandal from outside. It wasn't public relations. It was internal, deeply personal. A direct strike to the heart of the monarchy, delivered not by an outsider or tabloid, but by one of its own. As soon as word spread that the Queen had unexpectedly canceled her schedule, The palace machine began moving with its trademark efficiency. But this time, there was no precedent. No crisis manual on how to deal with a situation so delicate, so quietly explosive. At the center of this scramble was Sir Edward Young, then the Queen's private secretary. A shrewd operator with decades of institutional memory, Young immediately called for a closed-door meeting with select aides and senior courtiers. The objective was clear: find out what happened, contain it, and protect the Queen from further emotional harm. Paul Wybrew was not in that room, but he had already spoken to his senior under-butler. He had described, in vague terms, what he heard. Enough to alarm those present. Enough to confirm that Meghan had said something deeply disrespectful. But the exact words? No one dared repeat them aloud yet. They weren't written down. They weren't officially recorded. They existed in memory, floating like shards of broken glass. Within hours, a quiet consensus was reached. The confrontation would not be addressed. Not officially, not internally, not externally. It would be buried, covered by the blanket of royal discretion that had long protected the family from its own faults. But burying something doesn't make it disappear. The Queen's demeanor in the days that followed left aides deeply unsettled. She was not angry. She was not outwardly bitter. But she was distant. She sat longer in silence during meetings. She dismissed herself earlier from private dinners. During her evening walks in the garden, she often walked alone. The woman who had once greeted staff with warmth, who still chuckled at old jokes, who remembered birthdays and pets, was quiet, measured, hollow. It was then that the aides realized the damage wasn't just reputational. It was personal, and that made it far more dangerous. Behind the scenes, internal memos were drafted. Not about the incident itself, but about Meghan's future engagements. Quiet modifications were made to her itinerary. One official noted a marked reduction in unsupervised time with senior royals. Another recommended that any meetings between Meghan and the Queen going forward include a third party, a trusted aide or family member. Not as a form of surveillance, they argued, but as a safeguard. Whether those measures were ever formally implemented is unclear. But the shift was palpable. Meghan's access to the Queen grew more limited. Her influence, once touted as a breath of fresh air, was quietly restrained. Damage control didn't stop there. The palace communication team, led by a rotating circle of PR professionals, held emergency consultations. Not because the story had leaked, but because they knew it could, and they knew what it would mean if it did. If the public discovered that Meghan Markle had allegedly called the Queen irrelevant, or a stubborn old woman clinging to power, the outcry would be volcanic. Monarchists would erupt. The press would go into overdrive. It would undo years of cautious narrative building around the Sussexes. It would redefine the entire perception of the Queen's final months. And so, an invisible firewall was built. Every aide who had been in the vicinity that day was spoken to individually. Notes were taken. Silence was requested. Some were asked to sign supplemental confidentiality clauses, standard practice, the palace claimed, but suspiciously timed. Paul Wybrew, who had retired not long after, was never formally bound to the newer clauses. Perhaps that was why, in the end, he felt free to speak. Meanwhile, external messaging ramped up. Meghan's positive engagements were emphasized in press releases. Photos of her and the Queen at previous events were recirculated online. The aim was to reinforce an image of unity, to drown out whispers before they became shouts. The Queen herself said nothing. She didn't ask for retaliation. She didn't punish. She did what she had always done in the face of personal betrayal. She internalized it. But the aides didn't forget, and neither did the staff who had served her for decades. Behind closed doors, many were livid. They had seen her hold back tears after Diana's death. They had watched her stand alone at Philip's funeral. They had never seen her look more fragile than she did in the aftermath of that meeting with Meghan. One lady-in-waiting later said privately, "We knew it hurt her, but we didn't know how much." As weeks turned into months, the royal household operated like a well-rehearsed play. Every cue hit, every smile timed. But beneath the surface, the effects of that confrontation lingered. Tensions between staff who supported Meghan and those who didn't reached new highs. Gossip, usually frowned upon in the palace, became an undercurrent. People speculated not just about the words spoken, but about what it all meant. Was this a symptom of a deeper rift between the Queen and Harry? Was it the end of reconciliation? Could it have been avoided? One senior aide floated the idea of an intervention, a quiet meeting between Charles, William, and Harry to address the growing strain. But it never materialized. Harry and Meghan soon announced plans to step back from royal duties entirely, and by then, the damage had already been done. The Queen never referenced the confrontation in any formal capacity. She continued her duties. She honored her engagements. But those who watched closely saw a change in the texture of her days. Her energy waned. Her sparkle dimmed. The Queen, once the unwavering center of the Commonwealth, had been wounded in a way no title or crown could shield her from. And behind her, a small army of aides scrambled, not to erase what had happened, but to ensure the world would never know. At least, not then. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The monarchy, though battered by decades of scrutiny, still stood tall. The Queen, even as her age advanced, carried herself with grace. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the newly crowned Duke and Duchess of Sussex, were plastered across magazine covers and social media feeds as the modern face of the royal family. But behind the perfect smiles, curated press releases, and filtered Instagram posts, a confrontation had occurred that would never be officially acknowledged. A moment buried so deep within palace corridors that even seasoned reporters and royal watchers never caught its scent. For all the leaks that had poured out of royal circles in recent years, family tensions, tiara disputes, staff resignations, this one never made it into the public eye. Not at first, not for months. And when it did, it came not from a media frenzy or a hacked email, but from the lips of a man who had nothing left to gain. Paul Wybrew, the former footman, had carried the secret for as long as he could. And once he spoke, the shape of history began to shift. But let's pause and go back to the days and weeks immediately following the Queen's alleged confrontation with Meghan. The world was none the wiser. Media coverage at the time was focused elsewhere, on the couple's baby news, on their public appearances, on the growing rumors of a divide between William and Harry. Paparazzi swarmed airport tarmacs. Tabloid headlines speculated about everything from Meghan's wardrobe choices to her alleged feud with Kate. The idea that she had insulted the Queen to her face never crossed anyone's mind. It was simply too outlandish, too unimaginable. The palace press office, seasoned in decades of damage control, did its job flawlessly. Every time the Queen appeared in public, she was perfectly styled and impeccably posed. Every statement was worded with such practiced neutrality that not even the most cynical journalists could extract controversy. Meanwhile, the Queen's occasional appearances with Meghan, though fewer and more distant than before, were framed as harmonious. Photographers were briefed, media lines were fed, and the press, grateful for the access, played along. There was, of course, speculation behind the scenes. Royal reporters began to notice subtle changes. The Queen seemed increasingly absent from events involving the Sussexes. Her once affectionate remarks about Meghan during speeches were no longer included. William and Kate appeared more distant. But when journalists inquired about possible tension, they were met with the usual refrain, no comment. The British press, for all its appetite for royal scandal, is oddly bound by unwritten rules. They will report on divorces, dress codes, and disgraced cousins. But when it comes to the Queen, particularly in her final years, there existed a quiet reverence. Even tabloids knew to tread lightly. She was the national grandmother, the untouchable matriarch, the monarch who had seen the country through war, recession, and the death of Diana. Nobody wanted to be the one to accuse her of weakness, and nobody dared to imagine that someone within the family would dare wound her so deliberately. But in the backrooms of major newsrooms, questions circulated. Why had the Queen started canceling private meetings? Why had Meghan suddenly reduced her personal appearances with senior royals? Why were aides resigning in clusters? The answers were never written down. They were whispered, hinted at, swallowed by the weight of protocol and fear of legal action. And then came the distractions. The royal spectacles that ensured the media never had time to dig too deep. The Sussexes' tour of Africa. The release of Prince Andrew's disastrous BBC interview. The emergence of Megxit. The shocking announcement that Harry and Meghan would step down as working royals. These events were nuclear in scale, eclipsing all other palace dramas. Journalists and commentators could barely keep up. They dissected the Megxit statement, tracked the Sussexes' every move, and speculated endlessly about the fallout between brothers. It was perfect cover. The confrontation, now referred to in hushed tones by insiders as the Windsor incident, was successfully erased from public memory before it had even been known. Even palace aides who knew the truth participated in the charade, not because they supported what Meghan had said, but because their loyalty to the Queen demanded silence. She had made it clear, in her subtle, royal way, that she didn't want the matter pursued. To speak of it would dishonor her dignity. To deny it would expose a lie. So instead, they did what the palace always does. They let the moment slip into the fog of forgotten events. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry began their transition to a life outside royal duty. They moved to North America, launched Archewell, inked major deals with Netflix and Spotify, and gave interviews that shook the monarchy to its core. But still, even in their most explosive appearances, Meghan never mentioned the alleged confrontation with the Queen. Not even when speaking of institutional racism. Not even when discussing isolation. It was a line she never crossed, perhaps out of strategy, or perhaps because she knew how damning the truth might be. But the omission spoke volumes. There's a famous saying in British journalism, "The palace never lies, but it never tells the whole truth." That maxim held true throughout this period. While official statements reiterated unity and mutual respect, the silence between the Queen and Meghan became deafening. Observers began to note the Queen's changing body language. Her Christmas messages became more focused on legacy and duty than family warmth. The Sussexes were notably excluded from photo arrangements. Still, the public remained largely unaware of what had truly transpired. It wasn't until after the Queen's passing that the first real whispers began to surface. In the wake of her funeral, amid the ceremonial mourning and global tributes, a few anonymous palace staffers began to speak, off the record, always, and cautiously. One mentioned a meeting that had left Her Majesty visibly shaken. Another referred to a final straw in the Queen's attempts to reconcile the family. And then, quietly, Paul Wybrew's name surfaced. He had served the Queen for decades. Trusted, invisible, loyal. When he began speaking about that day at Windsor Castle, those who knew him were stunned, not by the revelation, but by the fact that he had finally broken his silence. What he said wasn't gossipy. It wasn't salacious. It was detailed, emotional, and respectful. But it was damning. And then the media finally began to pay attention. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic headline. But in pieces. Small columns. Anonymous quotes. YouTube creators and podcasters picking up on the story. Alternative news platforms dissecting Wybrew's statements. The mainstream press, as expected, remained cautious. Legal threats were issued. Some platforms took down content. But it was too late. The truth was out. Not confirmed, not proven, but believed. Enough to stir a reckoning. And suddenly, the public perception began to shift. People who had blindly supported Meghan began to ask questions. Was it true? Could she have said those things to the Queen? Why would Harry stay silent? Why didn't anyone speak up sooner? Royalists, already skeptical of the Sussexes' behavior, treated the revelation as confirmation of their worst suspicions. Monarchists called it betrayal. Others simply felt heartbreak that Queen Elizabeth's final chapter may have been marred by such cruelty. And then, as quickly as the story appeared, it began to fade again. The palace refused to comment. The Sussexes ignored all inquiries. Wybrew stepped back from interviews. But the damage was done. It was no longer about proof. It was about perception. What the press and public had never known was now the whisper that refused to be buried. The confrontation, once hidden behind layers of tradition, had become a ghost in the narrative of Queen Elizabeth's reign, never seen, but always felt. It raised questions about the institution's priorities, about its obsession with silence, about the emotional cost of discretion. But more than anything, it revealed how even the most powerful monarchy on earth couldn't hide pain forever.